Economic Calculation Demonstrated. Segment 2, The Experiment. SF Econ's demonstrations of a solved calculation problem are contained in a number of instructional video games. Each enacts the behaviors envisioned for pure anarcho-capitalism. These emulators are embedded in ordinary XO workbooks that can be freely downloaded from our online e-text. A link to the particular desktop prototype examined here is given in the show notes. It is recommended that a copy of this workbook be kept at hand for reference during your study. Segment 1 of this demonstration described a hypothetical global economy at an equilibrium upheld by optimality. Our contention that this state will remain stable throughout time can be verified by emulating the model's activity for an indefinite period. But obviously, this experiment would not be informative. As the model would be continuously regenerating its steady state, it would be impossible to tell if it were doing anything. We therefore propose a much more robust demonstration in which the model is challenged to discover a state that might be fully anticipated by trained economists. We know that if all the world's economies had exactly the same technical potential, the same production and utility parameters, then no economy would have any motive to trade with any other economy. Thus, a much more informative experiment might be initiated by suddenly unifying the demonstration model's boundary conditions for all three economies with respect to production of each of the 5 commodities. If this model is capable of economic calculation, then we should be able to observe the building up and working off of its physical assets to the end of recapitulating all the criteria of equilibrium, but in a state that presents nothing in the way of foreign trade. Here in the portal for Economy 1, we can see the sudden effects of unifying all the model economy's boundary conditions. Upon applying this initial stimulation, we observe that Economy 1's physical state no longer validates the criteria of equilibrium. Its input-output columns no longer add to 0, indicating that supply and demand are no longer equal for any of the commodities. And there is a net export of value that is reflected in cash flows that are out of balance. Once again, here is the initial steady state, and here is the state immediately after the stimulus. We can see that this stimulation's effect on Economy 1 has been rather slight. This is because our stimulation imposed Economy 1's production and utility parameters on the other 2 economies. Thus, the stimulation's only effects on Economy 1 are due to the import-export pressures exerted by the other 2 economies. When the emulator is launched, we see the physical rates of change continuously adjusting. Each refreshment of the portal occurs upon completion of 1 emulated year. Every number in the portal changes continuously until the new equilibrium is closely approximated. As the emulation terminates, we see that these transactions have operated to the end of creating a balance between domestic supply and demand, such that no commodity is imported or exported. The net export of value has all but vanished, and with it the imbalance in net cash flows. Repeating this experiment with focus shifted to Economy 2, we observe that this economy's stasis is also disrupted by the initial stimulation. Once again, here is the initial steady state, and here is the state immediately after the stimulus. Upon launching the emulator, we immediately observe continuous adjustments to the physical rates of change. As was the case for Economy 1, these rates of change quickly adjust toward the ultimate stasis. Then, after the initial stimulus is mostly absorbed, we see a pattern of gradual progress toward the final equilibrium at ever slower rates, as the progress itself absorbs more and more of the initial impulse. Eventually, every variable in the portal will have adjusted to the optimal equilibrium implicit in the new boundary conditions. When the emulation terminates, we see that these transactions have also operated to create a balance between domestic supply and demand, such that no commodity is imported or exported. The net export of value has all but vanished, and with it the imbalance in net cash flows. As all the economies have now adjusted to identical technical potential, they should present identical matrices of physical transactions at their new stasis. Recalling the terminal state of economy 1, we see that it aligns almost perfectly with the economic state arrived at here in economy 2. It should be clear that repeating this experiment, with focus shifted to the rates of change in economy 3, would reveal the same general pattern of adjustment just established for economies 1 and 2. Here is economy 3's initial state, and here is its state after adjustment to its new production and utility parameters. This outcome can be compared to economy 2's terminal state to show that our transient eventuated in the same distribution of assets for all three economies. Leaving the auditor to verify this result with his personal, downloaded copy of our demonstration program, we will shift the terms of economy 3's treatment to an examination of its prices and marginal valuations. Here are economy 3's prices and values at its initial stasis, where we can see that each sector agrees as to the value of each commodity. And each commodity's marginal value is equal to its marginal cost of production, which also equals the commodity's current transaction price. Upon unifying the boundary conditions for all three economies, we find that these optimal relations have been completely upset. There is little consistency in the values up and down columns of economy 3's values matrix. Time commences for this system when the emulator is launched. Thereafter we see all of economy 3's prices and values quickly realigning themselves, and then proceeding more or less in formation as they march toward the new, unique, and optimal stasis implicit in the new boundary conditions. As the new optimum comes into focus, we find none of the initial prices and values being recapitulated, except that the marginal values of economy 3's currency, in terms of itself, are once again unity for all sectors. Shifting focus once again, our experiment is repeated from the standpoint of global supply and demand. Recapitulating the criteria for physical equilibrium as expressed through this portal, we once again see that global supply and demand are equal for all commodities. And the global export-import matrix is balanced, such that each economy's balance of trade is null. Upon unifying the three economies' production and utility parameters, we see that global supply and demand are immediately thrown out of balance, and each of the three economies begins to experience a net import or export of value. When the emulation is launched, global supply and demand quickly reestablish a balance at close approximations to the rates at which they will ultimately settle. As the emulation proceeds, supply of each commodity in each economy closely balances its domestic demand, and values in the export-import array all but vanish. Our prototype's initial optimal financial state is balanced in the sense that every sector's dividends are exactly offset by its net cash flows. Here again, the imposition of new boundary conditions upsets this balance in every detail. When the emulator is launched, we see continuing adjustments to every monetary stock and flow. As was the case for adjustments to the model's physical states, the new financial state is quickly approximated, whereupon the model continues to approach its ultimate homeostasis asymptotically. In the simulation's final states, we see once again that dividends are everywhere offset by net cash flows. and there are no foreign financial positions requiring service in order to offset trade balances that are non-existent. The physical identity among our three model economies is reflected in that each economy presents the same interest rate, investment term, and leverage. Given identical boundary conditions, economies will only differ in respect to their currency values once the new stasis is reached. Finally, we examine the movement of all prices in all economies as they operate together, guiding the replenishments of assets toward ever closer embodiments of economic optimality. A matrix of prices by economy and commodity will be maintained here at the top of our display, while the matrix below will present prices as they change during the emulation. Both matrices presently express the model's initial homeostasis. When the system is stimulated by unifying the production and utility parameters for all three economies, we note that every price has changed. As the emulator is launched, we once again observe most of the volatility in these numbers occurring during the early years, while prices are settling down toward their new optimal values. Ultimately, a new homeostasis will be reached, and there will be no further changes in any price, because they are all efficient in respect to the new system boundary. It should be noted that, at either end of the experiment, the ratio of any two prices is the same across all three economies. These ratios carry through to the absolute commodity values reported in row 0 of these displays. Changes in the commodity values during the course of this experiment are dictated by changes in the system's boundary conditions, not by anything occurring in terms of financial stocks and flows. With the number of value units constrained to a fixed quantity, absolute commodity values are temporally meaningful indicia of changes in the economy's technical potential. The absolute value of the value unit in terms of itself is contrived to always equal unity. Thus, the price of the value unit in any given currency is a cardinal expression of the currency's value as it changes with time. Please keep in mind that this model never had any awareness of our expectation that the new homeostasis it was creating would exhibit a null export-import array. The model is a true finite state machine in that all it ever knows or can know is its current state and its rules for advancing to its next state. It lives entirely in the now. It cannot process information regarding a past or future. It never formulated the ultimate state implicit in its new parameters. It was never aware of that state's proximity, and will not, in the least, change its behavior as the ultimate stasis arrives. Thus, the model operating here is a spontaneously self-organizing dynamic system, which we have put forward as the proper method with which to represent the objective economy's default mode of operations. While the economist might or might not be disposed to accept this view, we hope that he is now challenged to offer some alternate account as to how all of these arrays of numbers are always seen to flow toward their uniquely homeostatic interrelations. Until one such alternative is presented, we will persist in our claim that SF Econ's prototypes achieve their optimal stasis by performing economic calculation.